While you were watching the price chart, Ripple was quietly turning itself into a bank, and almost nobody talking about XRP right now is paying attention to it. Everyone keeps asking the same question. Why does XRP keep getting good news and the price barely moves? The SEC lawsuit is over. Spot ETFs launched in the United States. Institutions are buying. And yet XRP is still down more than 50% from where it started the year. That frustration is real, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't. But there's a completely different story unfolding right now underneath the price chart, and once you see it, you'll understand why so many long-term holders are refusing to sell, no matter how ugly the short-term action looks. Here's the story nobody's telling you. Ripple isn't just a crypto company anymore. It is actively building itself into a regulated financial institution, brick by brick, and it's doing it faster than almost anyone in this industry. Back in December, Ripple won conditional approval from the OCC, the federal regulator that supervises national banks in the United States, to operate its own national trust bank. That is not a small thing. That's the same category of approval that traditional banking giants need. On top of that, Ripple has applied for a Federal Reserve master account, which would plug the company directly into the central bank's own payment rails, the same infrastructure that JP Morgan and Bank of America use. If that gets approved, Ripple would no longer need to rely on intermediary banks to move money. It would have a direct line into the heart of the American financial system. And Ripple isn't waiting around for approval to start acting like a financial powerhouse. Over the last year, the company has spent more than $2.4 billion acquiring a prime broker, a payments platform, and a treasury software firm. Think about what that actually means. A prime broker is the kind of business that hedge funds and large institutions use to manage trading, lending, and custody. A treasury software firm handles the exact tools corporations use to manage their cash and settlements. Ripple isn't collecting these companies for fun. It's assembling the pieces of a full-scale financial infrastructure business, the kind of thing that usually takes decades to build inside a traditional bank. Now let's talk about the stablecoin that's becoming the real engine underneath all of this, RLUSD. Ripple has been aggressively expanding minting of RLUSD across both the XRP ledger and Ethereum. In just 2 days recently, Ripple issued close to $292 million worth of new RLUSD, with the overwhelming majority, about 77%, minted directly on the XRP ledger. After accounting for burns and redemptions, XRPL's net RLUSD supply grew by over $167 million in that short window alone. Total RLUSD supply now sits close to $1.6 billion, split almost evenly between XRPL and Ethereum. And Ripple isn't stopping at the US and Ethereum. It just received approval from Japan's Financial Services Agency to launch RLUSD in one of the largest and most tightly regulated financial markets on Earth. That's a government regulator in a major economy signing off on Ripple's stablecoin operating within its borders. Here's why this matters more than people realize. RLUSD isn't just sitting there as a number on a chart, it's actually moving. Settlement volume tied to RLUSD on the XRP ledger has already pushed past $2.5 billion, and in the first quarter of this year alone, RLUSD transfer volume topped $18 billion. That's real money, moving through real transactions, on real infrastructure that Ripple controls. This is the difference between a coin that exists because people are speculating on it and a network that's actually being used to move value at scale. While all of this stablecoin and banking infrastructure is being built, something else is happening on the XRP ledger itself that barely gets mentioned. Tokenized real-world assets on XRPL have exploded from under $1 billion at the start of the year to $3.5 billion now. Daily transactions on the ledger hit 3 million earlier this year, 3 times the average from just 12 months ago. And Ripple recently unveiled a system that lets AI agents pay directly using XRP and RLUSD through something called the X402 protocol, essentially wiring artificial intelligence systems directly into the XRP ledger's payment rails. As AI agents increasingly need to transact autonomously, machine to machine, without a human clicking approve, having a fast, cheap settlement layer built specifically for that purpose could turn out to be one of the most underrated stories in this entire space. Now, here's where it gets interesting from an institutional money perspective. Goldman Sachs, one of the largest and most conservative banks on Wall Street, disclosed a position worth over $153 million spread across 4 different spot XRP ETFs. Let that land for a second. This is not a retail trader on an app. This is Goldman Sachs in a public regulatory filing, confirming it now holds a meaningful position in XRP through regulated investment vehicles. When a bank like that starts showing up in the filings, it tells you institutional appetite for exposure to this asset is not going away, regardless of what the daily price chart looks like. So why hasn't any of this shown up in the price yet? This is the honest, uncomfortable part of the story. Of Ripple's roughly 300 banking partners around the world, only about 40% actually use Ripple's on-demand liquidity product, the service that requires banks to actually buy and use XRP to settle cross-border payments. The other 60% use Ripple's messaging infrastructure to route payments without ever touching XRP itself. That means a huge chunk of Ripple's business success, the bank charter, the acquisitions, the stablecoin growth, doesn't automatically translate into direct demand for the token. Ripple the company can thrive while XRP the token lags behind, and that's exactly what's been happening for most of this year. This is precisely why the Clarity Act matters so much, and why it connects directly back to everything we just talked about. If that legislation passes and legally classifies XRP as a commodity, it removes the exact legal uncertainty that's been keeping cautious banks parked on messaging rails instead of converting to on-demand liquidity. Analysts already project ODL volume could grow 30 to 50% year over year across active corridors once that uncertainty clears. Corridors like the US dollar to Mexican peso through Bitso and the US dollar to Philippine peso through coins.ph. Standard Chartered's long-term roadmap, $7 in 2027, $12.60 in 2028, climbing toward $28 by 2030, is built entirely on the assumption that this conversion from messaging partners to actual ODL users keeps accelerating. So here's the real picture. Ripple is building a licensed, regulated financial empire in plain sight. A trust bank, a Fed master account application, billions in strategic acquisitions, a stablecoin crossing $18 billion in quarterly transfer volume, $3.5 billion in tokenized assets on its ledger, and Goldman Sachs quietly buying in through the front door. None of that shows up as a green candle on your trading app today. But infrastructure like this doesn't get built by companies planning to disappear. It gets built by companies positioning themselves to be the backbone of how money moves for the next decade. The frustrating part is patience. The XRP price chart doesn't care about regulatory filings or acquisition announcements, at least not immediately. But every piece we just walked through, the bank charter, the Fed account application, RLUSD's explosive growth, the tokenized asset boom, Goldman's position, they're all data points pointing the same direction. Ripple is not slowing down, it's accelerating, and it's doing it while everyone's attention stays locked on the price candle of the day. There's also a quieter signal sitting in the technical data that supports this same story. Analyst Ali Martinez recently pointed out that the Tom DeMark sequential indicator, a tool used to spot potential turning points in a trend, flashed a buy signal on XRP, alongside rising network activity across the ledger. At the same time, he noted that some larger wallets, often called whales, have trimmed their exposure recently, which on its own could be read as a caution flag. But here's the thing about markets like this. You almost never get a setup where every single signal points the same direction at the same time. What you're looking for is whether the weight of the evidence leans one way. And right now, between the institutional filings, the stablecoin growth, the tokenized asset explosion, and the infrastructure Ripple is building, the weight leans toward a company and a network expanding its real-world footprint, even while short-term price action stays messy. It's also worth remembering just how fast the landscape around Ripple has shifted in a very short window. A year ago, RLUSD barely existed as a serious product. Today it's approaching $2 billion in supply, licensed for operation in Japan, and already responsible for billions of dollars in quarterly settlement volume. A year ago, tokenized real-world assets on the XRP ledger were under $1 billion. Today they sit at $3.5 billion and climbing. A year ago, nobody was talking about AI agents settling payments directly through XRP. Today, Ripple has already rolled out the infrastructure to make that possible. When you stack these developments side by side and compare them to where things stood 12 months ago, the pace of build-out looks less like a company treading water and more like a company racing to lock in position before the rest of the financial world catches up. None of this guarantees the price does anything specific tomorrow, next week, or even next month. Crypto markets move on sentiment and macro conditions just as much as fundamentals, sometimes more. But the next time someone tells you nothing is happening with XRP because the chart looks flat or red, you'll know that underneath the surface, Ripple is quietly assembling one of the most ambitious regulated financial infrastructure plays in the entire industry. If this kind of deep dive is what you come to this channel for, hit subscribe, drop a like, and let me know in the comments whether you think Ripple's banking transformation ends up dragging XRP's price along with it, or whether the company keeps winning while the token gets left behind. I'll see you in the next video.